I was 14 years old, sitting in the jump seat of a Boeing 737, when Captain Morrison collapsed face first into the control panel at 35,000 feet. That's how it started. Not with warning lights or alarms, but with the sudden, sickening thud of a 200-pound man hitting the yoke, which screamed to life beneath his dead weight. The co-pilot, First Officer Chen, jerked toward him, hands already reaching, but by then the plane had already started its terrible dance. I didn't understand what I was seeing. My brain refused to process it. The man who'd let me sit up here, who'd smiled at me through the cockpit door just 5 minutes earlier, had just become a problem nobody could solve. But let me back up. Let me tell you how a kid like me ended up in that seat in the first place. My name is Marcus Williams. I'm black, I'm from Southside Chicago, and my mother worked 3 jobs to send me to summer aviation camp. Not the expensive one at the big aviation academy, the scholarship program through the Boys and Girls Club. The kind that cost nothing and meant everything. I'd been dreaming about flying since I was 6 years old, when my grandfather took me to O'Hare and let me watch the planes take off. He's gone now. Cancer. But I still remember him saying, "That's freedom right there, Marcus. That's a black man controlling something that costs $50 million. Granddad never made it past high school. He worked in construction his whole life. But he understood something about what flying meant, especially for someone who looked like me. It wasn't just about the planes. It was about proving you belonged in spaces where people didn't expect to see you." The camp was 6 weeks, 3 times a week at a small regional airport outside the city. We learned about aerodynamics, weather systems, navigation, the physics of lift. I was the youngest in the program. Most kids were 16 or 17. But I had something they didn't. I paid attention like my life depended on it. Which it did. My mom had told me straight up that this was my one shot. "You mess this up," she'd said, "and we don't get another summer. You hear me?" I heard her. I always heard her. The instructors noticed me. There was this one guy, Mr. Patterson, who ran the program. He was a retired commercial pilot, maybe 60 years old, with gray at his temples, and this way of explaining things that made everything click into place. He never talked down to me. He treated every question like it mattered, because to him, it did. One afternoon, after a classroom session on instrument flying, he pulled me aside in the hallway. "You're different," he said. Not like it was a compliment, just an observation. "You listen like you're trying to remember something. Most kids listen like they're waiting for their turn to talk." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. "I've got a friend," he continued. "Captain Morrison, good man, flies for Midwest Regional. Next week they've got a training flight, short hop, Chicago to Indianapolis. Pilots checking their hours, nothing serious. I mentioned you. He said if you're interested, he'll let you observe from the jump seat. Real flight, real instruments, everything." Mr. Patterson's eyes were serious. "You want that?" I felt something crack open in my chest. A real flight. Not a simulator, not a video. A real plane with real pilots doing real flying. "Yeah," I said. "Yes, I want that." "Then you show up early. You dress nice, you ask questions that matter, and you don't touch anything. You understand?" "Yes, sir, I understand." My mom cried when I told her. Not sad crying, the other kind. She sat down at the kitchen table, this old Formica thing we'd had since I was little, and just sat there with her hands over her mouth. Our apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, and she'd been up since 5 that morning working her shift at the hospital. But for a moment, she just sat there. "Your grandfather would lose his mind," she whispered. I was wearing the shirt she'd bought me for the occasion when I showed up at the airport that Tuesday morning. New jeans, new sneakers, not fancy but clean, the laces still stiff. Mr. Patterson was already there, standing near the gate with a tall white man in a dark blue pilot uniform. Captain Morrison. He had a weathered face, the kind of face that had seen a lot of sky, and when he shook my hand, his grip was firm but kind. "Marcus," he said, "Patrick Patterson tells me you're going to be somebody someday." "I'm going to try, sir," I said. "That's all any of us can do." The flight was supposed to be routine. Midwest Regional Flight 447, departing Chicago Midway at 8:15 a.m., arriving Indianapolis International at 9:45 a.m. 53 minutes of flight time. Captain Morrison had done it hundreds of times. First Officer Chen was sharp, younger, maybe 40, with a quiet competence that I recognized even then. The flight attendant, a woman named Sandra, was kind. She'd brought me a ginger ale before we pushed back and asked me to let her know if I needed anything. Everything felt normal. More than normal. It felt like the beginning of something. The pre-flight checks took forever, and I watched every second of it. Morrison and Chen moving through the checklist with this practiced rhythm, calling out systems, confirming readings, testing controls. I was taking mental notes, trying to memorize the sequence, the terminology, the way their hands moved across the panels. This was the real thing. This was what it looked like when professionals did their jobs perfectly. We pushed back at 8:12. The engines spooled up with this deep, rolling sound that I felt in my bones. We taxied toward the runway, and Morrison's voice came through the radio, smooth and clear, requesting clearance. The tower cleared us. We were number 1 for takeoff. Morrison advanced the throttles. The engines roared. The plane surged forward, and I felt the acceleration like a hand pushing me back in my seat. Faster, faster, the runway rolling beneath us. And then, that moment I'd been waiting for my whole life. The nose came up, and the wheels left the ground. We were flying. I couldn't stop smiling. I was trying to be professional, trying to look like someone who belonged in a cockpit, but I was grinning like an idiot. Morrison glanced over and winked at me. He knew. He understood what this meant. The climb was smooth. We leveled off at our assigned altitude, around 35,000 feet, and Morrison gave me a thumbs up. Chen was handling most of the communications now, monitoring the autopilot, keeping an eye on systems. Morrison leaned back slightly in his seat, the way you do when things are running right and there's nothing to worry about. That was when it happened. 1 second he was fine. The next, his head jerked backward like someone had yanked on an invisible cord. His eyes went wide. I saw that. I'll never unsee that. And then his body went rigid. His hands clenched on the armrests. Then he collapsed forward, his full weight hitting the yoke. The plane screamed, not a gentle alarm, a full, ear-splitting scream of warning. The nose dropped. My stomach went somewhere around my knees. Chen was already moving, reaching across, trying to support Morrison's weight. But Morrison was dead weight. Literally dead weight, I thought. Oh God, is he dead? And Chen couldn't do anything but grab him and try to keep him off the controls while also managing the plane that was now in a dive. "Mayday, Mayday, Midwest 447, Chen was saying, his voice steady but shaking underneath. "We have an emergency. Captain is incapacitated. Medical emergency. We're requesting immediate—" But I wasn't listening anymore. I was watching the altitude indicator. We'd been at 35,000 feet. Now we were at 34,000. 33. The descent was accelerating. The plane was going down, and the only pilot who could save us was the one lying across the controls, apparently unconscious or worse. Sandra appeared in the cockpit doorway, her face going white. "What's happening? Captain, are you—" "Get back," Chen snapped, not looking at her. "Close the door. Tell the flight attendants to prepare for emergency descent, now." I sat frozen in the jump seat. My hands were gripping the edge of the seat so hard my knuckles had turned white. My heart wasn't beating, it was vibrating. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. An hour ago I was thinking about how cool the instruments looked. Now I was in a plane with a dying pilot and a co-pilot who was trying to fly with one hand while holding a 200-pound unconscious man with the other. Chen pulled Morrison back slightly, away from the yoke, and the descent slowed. But Morrison's breathing was wrong. Shallow. Gasping. His face was gray. "We're looking at cardiac event," Chen was saying to the tower now, and his voice had changed. It was colder. Professional. The voice of someone who had trained for this exact moment. "Possibly stroke. I'm going to need medical standby at our nearest suitable airport. I can't leave the controls. I'm going to need—" He looked at me. For just a second, his eyes found mine. "Kid," he said, "how old are you?" 14, I whispered. "Ever touched a yoke before?" "No, sir." "We just did simulator. Here's what you're going to do," he said, and his voice was ice. "You're going to unfasten your belt. You're going to come around here. You're going to put your hands on that yoke, and you're going to hold it exactly level. Not up, not down. Level. Can you do that?" I couldn't do that. I was 14. I was supposed to be taking notes. I was supposed to be the kid watching from the jump seat, but the plane was falling, and nobody else could save it. "Yes," I heard myself say. "Yes, sir." I unbuckled my belt with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. The plane was still descending, but slower now. 30,000 feet, 29. The altimeter was like a countdown to the end of the world. Chen had Morrison's wrist, checking his pulse, and I could see the answer in the way his jaw tightened. "Come on," Chen said to me. "Let's go." I stood up. My legs held. Somehow, they held. "Put your hands on the yoke," he instructed. "Feel the pressure I'm using, exactly that much. When I say level, you adjust until the horizon line lines up with the markers on the attitude indicator. You see it?" I looked at the instruments. Everything was a blur of numbers and lines and things that meant nothing. But the attitude indicator, that one I understood. The little airplane symbol on the display with the horizon line. It was tilted down. The nose was down. If I leveled it, I could stop the descent. "I see it," I said. "Hands on," Chen commanded. I put my hands on the yoke. It was warm from Morrison's grip. My hands were shaking so badly I thought I'd break something. "Gentle," Chen said. "Gentle pressure, just like you're guiding a bicycle. No sudden movements." I pulled back on the yoke, very slightly. The nose came up. The horizon line moved. I adjusted, felt the altitude stop dropping so fast, felt the plane respond to my hands like it was alive and listening to what I was telling it. "Good," Chen said. His voice was the only solid thing in the universe. "Hold that. Keep the wings level. You're doing good. You're doing better than good. You're keeping everyone alive." Behind us, Morrison made a sound. A wet, terrible sound. But Chen didn't look at him. He was looking at me. "What's your name?" he asked. "Marcus," I said. "Marcus Williams." "Well, Marcus Williams," Chen said, "you've got about 8 minutes until we reach Indianapolis. All you have to do is keep this plane exactly where it is right now. Can you do that?" I could feel 180 people behind me. Passengers who had no idea what was happening. Parents, kids, people going home or going to work or going to be with someone they loved. And all of them were alive because a 14-year-old black kid from Southside Chicago was holding a yoke in his shaking hands. "I can do it," I said. And as the plane leveled out and Indianapolis appeared on the horizon, as Chen was already talking to the tower, as Morrison lay unconscious beside me and Sandra was crying in the galley, I realized something. This wasn't the beginning of the story. This was the middle. The real story, the impossible part, was just beginning. The descent slowed. The altitude stabilized. Indianapolis appeared on the horizon like a prayer answered, and I realized I'd been holding my breath for so long that my lungs burned. Chen's voice came through the radio, steady and controlled, telling them we had a medical emergency, that Captain Morrison was incapacitated, that we were coming in hot but stable. The tower cleared everyone else out of our way. We owned the sky now, and the only thing keeping 180 people alive was a 14-year-old kid's hands on a yoke and a co-pilot's absolute refusal to break. "You're doing beautiful," Chen said. "Not good. Beautiful." Like I was a piece of art he was watching come together. 8 minutes. Just keep her level. Don't think about anything else. Just the horizon line. That's your whole world right now. My whole world. The horizon line. The little airplane symbol on the screen in front of me. My hands steady now, they'd stopped shaking. Fear had crystallized into something colder, something that worked. Behind me, I could hear Sandra on the interphone, telling the other flight attendants to prepare for emergency landing, to make sure everyone was sled and braced. The routine of crisis. The choreography of survival. Morrison was still breathing, but barely. Chen had loosened his uniform, had his hand on the man's shoulder like he was trying to will him to stay conscious. But Morrison's eyes were glassy, unfocused. Whatever had happened to him, stroke, heart attack, aneurysm, it wasn't stopping. The man who'd let me sit in this jump seat, who'd smiled at me and said I was going to be somebody, was dying 6 feet away from me while I flew his plane. "First officer, do we have a gate at Indianapolis?" Morrison's voice came out thin, reedy. He was conscious. Barely. "Captain," Chen said gently, and I heard something crack in his voice. "Save your strength." Do we have a gate? Morrison insisted, the words slurring slightly. We have a gate. We have ambulances. We have everything we need. You're going to be okay. It wasn't true. We all knew it wasn't true. But Chen said it anyway because that's what you do when you're trying to hold someone together. You lie beautifully. 5 minutes to Indianapolis. The radio traffic thickened, emergency services being dispatched, fire trucks rolling, the airport going into emergency mode because of us. Because a kid from Southside Chicago was holding a yoke and the sky was listening. Marcus, Chen said, and my name in his mouth sounded different than it ever had before, like it meant something, like I meant something. When we touch down, you're going to keep that yoke exactly as it is until the wheels are on the ground. The moment we land, you let go. You don't touch anything. You unbuckle and you move to the back of the plane. Understand? Yes, sir, I said. You did this, he continued. You understand that? Whatever happens next, you did this. You saved this plane. You saved these people. Remember that. The runway appeared. Indianapolis was directly below us now. Chen was on the radio with tower and approach, getting vectors, confirming the emergency equipment was standing by. The plane was responding perfectly to my inputs, which meant I was responding perfectly, which meant somewhere along the way, my hands had learned to speak the language of flight. The language that didn't require words, the language that was just intention and control, and the absolute refusal to let people die on your watch. 2 minutes. Gear down, Chen called, and I heard the hydraulics engage beneath us, felt the slight change in the plane's attitude as the landing gear deployed. 1 minute. Flaps 15, he said, and then, flaps 25, and the plane slowed, sank, became a bird preparing to land. You've got this, Chen whispered, and I don't know if he was talking to me or Morrison or himself. 30 seconds. The runway rushed up. I could see the fire trucks lined up on the tarmac, see the ambulances, see the people in white shirts pointing. My hands were steady. The horizon line was steady. The airplane symbol was level, and the world was exactly as it should be. Contact, someone said on the radio, tower, calling our altitude. Reduce power, Chen instructed me. Gentle, you're bringing her down. The wheels touched down first, a small bump, almost gentle, and then the whole plane was on the ground, rolling, decelerating, alive. The engines screamed in reverse thrust. The wheels rolled. And then, slowly, smoothly, the plane came to a stop. We were down. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The silence was absolute, filled with the sound of engines spooling down and people breathing, and the weight of something enormous that had just been lifted. Then, Chen's hand was on my shoulder, gripping hard. You did it, Marcus. You saved us. You saved everyone. The cockpit door burst open. Sandra stood there, tears streaming down her face, and behind her were other flight attendants, other passengers looking confused and terrified and alive. The ambulance was already moving toward us. The fire trucks were rolling. The whole world was coming to help. Morrison made a sound, a low, gurgling sound. Chen was already checking his pulse, already calling for the paramedics, already doing the things a professional does when the emergency is real and present and now. I unbuckled. My legs didn't work at first. I had to grip the armrest to stand, but I stood. I moved to the back of the cockpit, and I watched as Chen worked on Morrison's body with the calm efficiency of someone who'd trained for this. The man's skin was gray now. His breathing had stopped. The paramedics came in like a controlled storm, with equipment and expertise and the language of medicine. They pushed Chen aside gently, took over Morrison's body, started the choreography of resurrection. Chest compressions, oxygen, defibrillator, all of it happening in the cockpit of a Boeing 737 that had landed safely because a kid had held the yoke. Someone put a blanket around my shoulders. Someone asked if I was hurt. Someone was taking statements, taking names, asking what happened. I answered in a voice that didn't sound like mine, because I was already somewhere else. I was still at 35,000 feet. I was still flying. The paramedics wheeled Morrison out on a stretcher. His chest was heaving. They'd gotten a rhythm. His eyes were closed. His face was the color of old paper. Chen found me as they were taking Morrison away. The first officer looked like he'd aged 10 years in 30 minutes. His uniform was soaked with sweat. His hands were shaking for the first time since this had started. "We need to talk to you," he said quietly. "After we get everyone off the plane, after we debrief, there's going to be questions. Federal Aviation Administration, NTSB. Everyone's going to want to know what happened up there." "Okay," I said. "You're going to be famous," he said. "You understand that? There's no way to keep this quiet. You flew a plane, Marcus. You brought us down. That's not a secret that stays secret." I didn't feel famous. I felt small. I felt like a kid who'd been put in a situation he had no business being in, and who'd somehow not screwed it up. I felt like my mother's face was going to change forever when she found out about this. I felt like the sky had reached down and touched me, and I would never be the same again. The next hours were a blur. Passengers filing out, being met by family and counselors, statements being taken. Chen defending my presence in the cockpit, explaining the situation, making it clear that I'd been essential to the emergency response. Federal investigators looking at me with expressions I couldn't read. Questions about my training, my experience, my understanding of what I was doing. And through it all, one thought. Captain Morrison, is he okay? Is he alive? The answer came 12 hours later. Morrison had suffered a massive stroke. The paramedics had gotten his heart restarted, but the damage was extensive. He regained consciousness briefly in the hospital, long enough to ask what happened. When they told him that his passenger, the kid from the summer camp, had flown the plane down, he'd cried. Not from relief, from something else. From knowing that his flying days were over, and that they'd ended with a kid doing what he no longer could. I visited him in the hospital 3 days later. My mother came with me, nervous in a way I'd never seen her nervous before. She kept asking if I was sure, if I wanted to do this, if I was ready. I wasn't ready, but I went anyway. Morrison was in a private room, hooked up to machines that beeped and hummed. The right side of his face drooped slightly. His speech was slurred, but understandable. "Marcus," he said when he saw me, "come here." I came. My mother hung back by the door, giving us space. "Thank you," Morrison said. Simple, direct. The words of a man who understood that some things didn't need elaboration. "You would have done the same thing," I said. "No," he replied. "I would have been paralyzed. I would have frozen. But you flew. At 14 years old, you flew." He closed his eyes. "I'm sorry I can't keep flying. I'm sorry I had to give it to you to finish." "You didn't give it to me," I said. "You showed me it was possible." The news broke 2 days later, local news first, then national, then international. The headline was everywhere. 14-year-old saves flight after both pilots incapacitated. My face was on television. My name was in newspapers. My mother cried again, and this time they were tears of pride so intense she could barely speak. Mr. Patterson called to say he'd known, somehow, that this was what I was meant to do. My school called. The Boys and Girls Club called. Everyone wanted a piece of the story. But there was something else in the news. Something that started small and grew bigger. First Officer Chen gave an interview where he praised me, where he explained the emergency, where he made it clear that I'd been the difference between life and death. The FAA released a statement saying that my actions had been appropriate and commendable, that I'd received instructions and had followed them perfectly. Everything was good. Everything was right. Then, a week later, a reporter noticed something odd. Captain Morrison had a history. Not criminal, but troubling. Rumors of substance abuse years back. A DUI arrest that had been plea bargained down. A pattern of incidents that suggested someone who was not entirely stable. The reporter dug deeper, and what he found was that Captain Morrison should never have been cleared to fly again after that last incident. There was paperwork that had been falsified, certifications that had been backdated. Someone at Midwest Regional had covered for him, had made it possible for a pilot with a serious history to get back in the cockpit. The reporter's investigation expanded. It turned out the person who'd done the covering was the chief pilot, a man named Richard Dalton. A man who'd been Morrison's friend since flight school. A man who'd decided that his friendship was more important than safety regulations. The story became bigger, much bigger. Not just about a kid saving a plane, but about corruption in the airline industry. About how someone had risked 180 lives because he wanted to help his friend. The FAA launched an investigation. The news cycle intensified. And then something happened that nobody expected. Captain Morrison, from his hospital bed, decided to talk. He gave an interview to the same reporter who'd uncovered the falsification. He admitted everything. He'd struggled with addiction for years. He'd gotten clean, or so he'd thought, but he'd been drinking again, more heavily each month. His friend Dalton had known. Dalton had covered for him because Dalton believed in second chances. Dalton had also, Morrison now realized, endangered everyone who flew with him. And Morrison himself, he'd endangered them. He'd gotten in that cockpit knowing he wasn't well, keeping his health was questionable, because he loved flying more than he loved safety. If it wasn't for that boy, Morrison said in the interview, his voice thick with emotion and the residual effects of his stroke, everyone on that plane would be dead, and it would have been my fault alone. And I'd like to apologize to everyone on Flight 447. I'd like to apologize to my crew. And I'd like to thank Marcus Williams for having more courage in his 14 years than I had in 52. The interview aired on a Thursday evening. By Friday morning, Richard Dalton had been fired. The FAA was moving to revoke Morrison's license permanently. The airline was facing federal investigation. And I was sitting in my high school cafeteria, trying to eat a sandwich while everyone around me whispered and pointed. That was when the worst part started. People who'd known Dalton, who'd benefited from his connections, who'd covered for him in small ways over the years, they started talking. They started saying that the reporter had gotten it wrong, that Morrison was just trying to save face, that a boy couldn't possibly fly a plane, that there must have been something else going on. They started attacking my credibility. They started suggesting that maybe I'd had help. Maybe Chen had actually been flying the whole time. Maybe I was just a kid who'd been given credit for someone else's work. A blog post went viral. It said that the entire story was a cover-up, that the real issue was Chen's incompetence, and that the airline was using me as a scapegoat to hide larger problems. It said my mother had probably coached me to tell the story, that this was all a setup to get money from the airline. It said I was a liar and a fraud, and that I should be ashamed for letting a good man like Dalton take the fall. I read it in my bedroom. My mother was at work. I was alone, and I read every word of that post, and I felt something inside me break. Not from anger, from something worse. From doubt. Had I really flown the plane? Or had I just been holding the yoke while Chen did the work? Had I imagined my competence? Had I convinced myself that I was important when really I was just a kid who'd been lucky? The post had comments, hundreds of them, some defending me, most attacking me. People called me a liar. People said I was destroying a man's career for fame. People questioned whether a black kid from Chicago could possibly have the training or intelligence to do what I was claiming. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell anyone. I just sat with it, and I let it poison the thing that should have been pure. 3 weeks later, I got a call from a lawyer. Not my lawyer, I didn't have one. This was a lawyer for Richard Dalton. He was calling to inform me that his client was filing a defamation suit against me and against First Officer Chen. He said that my statements to the FAA and the media had constituted false and malicious statements that had caused his client to lose his job, his reputation, and his ability to work in the industry. He said that unless we retracted our statements and issued a public apology, he would pursue this in court. The phone call ended. I sat there, holding the receiver, and I understood something that nobody had taught me at aviation camp. Flying a plane was easy. It was what came after that was impossible. My mother called a lawyer, a real one. He listened to everything, and then he said something that changed everything. "They don't have a case," he said. "Everything you said is corroborated by physical evidence, by witnesses, by the FAA investigation. But they're going to file anyway, because lawsuits don't have to be winnable to be destructive. They just have to be expensive." The lawsuit was filed 2 weeks later. It was covered in the news. The narrative shifted. Now it was, teenager sued by former airline executive, and people who'd been on my side started questioning whether I'd been truthful. people who doubted me felt vindicated. The story became complicated in a way that the original story was not. The FAA investigation concluded. It confirmed everything. Morrison had been flying under falsified certifications. Dalton had known and had covered it up. And I had, in fact, flown the plane down with First Officer Chen's guidance. Every detail of my testimony was accurate. Dalton's lawyer responded by claiming that the FAA investigation was incomplete, that there were questions about my training and my presence in the cockpit that hadn't been answered, that the entire narrative was being controlled by the airline to protect itself from liability. The lawsuit dragged on. Months became a year. My mother spent money she didn't have on lawyers. I went to school and tried to be a normal teenager while my name was attached to words like defamation and fraud. The thing that should have been a story of triumph became a story of attack and defense. Then, at the end of the first year, something happened. First Officer Chen was being interviewed by a podcast. A real one, not some fringe thing. The host asked him about the lawsuit, about the allegations that the story had been exaggerated or falsified. And Chen did something that nobody expected. He brought the evidence. He had flight data recorder information. He had radio recordings. He had his own training records and his analysis of the situation. And he laid it all out, methodically, clearly, in a way that left no room for interpretation. He explained the forces acting on the plane. He explained why someone with training could follow instructions, but someone without training could not. He explained, in technical detail, exactly why a 14-year-old boy could not possibly have accidentally flown a plane down safely. Marcus Williams saved this flight, Chen said, his voice steady and final. And I'm going to spend the rest of my career making sure that everyone understands that. Every time someone questions it, I'm going to provide the evidence. Every time someone lies about it, I'm going to correct them. Because that boy did something extraordinary, and I won't let anyone diminish that. The podcast went viral in a different way. This wasn't entertainment. This was a professional pilot with decades of experience, putting his credibility on the line to defend a teenager he barely knew. The comments changed. The narrative shifted. People who'd been uncertain became certain. People who'd been attacking became quiet. Dalton's lawyer tried to respond, but there was nothing to respond to. The evidence was there. The physics was there. The testimony was there. The case was dead, and everyone knew it. It took another 6 months, but eventually Dalton dropped the lawsuit. He filed for bankruptcy. He moved to a different state. He disappeared from the public conversation, which was its own kind of verdict. But the damage was already done. The year of the lawsuit had changed something in me. I'd learned that telling the truth wasn't enough, that being right wasn't enough, that doing something extraordinary didn't protect you from people who wanted to tear you down. I'd learned that the story of what happened in the sky was less important than the story people wanted to tell about what happened in the sky. So when I graduated high school and applied to the Air Force Academy, I was a different person than the boy who'd sat in that jump seat. I was harder. I was more careful. I was less willing to trust the world to be fair. But I was also absolutely, unshakably certain about what I wanted to do with my life. The day I got my acceptance letter, my mother cooked my favorite meal. We sat at that old Formica table where she'd cried when I told her about the flight. She cried again when I showed her the letter, but these were tears of a different kind. These were tears of arrival. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she whispered. "I know," I said, and I did know, because he'd understood something that I was only now fully grasping. Flying wasn't about the plane. It was about proving that you belonged in spaces where people didn't expect to see you. It was about taking control of something powerful and making it serve your will. It was about freedom, but not the kind you get handed to you, the kind you take. The Air Force Academy was harder than anything I'd experienced. The training was relentless, the competition was fierce, and every single day, someone was trying to prove that I didn't belong there, that I'd gotten in because of the publicity of the Flight 447 incident, that I wasn't good enough to be a real pilot. I ignored them, because I'd already flown a plane when I was supposed to be terrified. Everything else was just details. By my senior year at the academy, I was one of the top pilots in my class. By the time I graduated, I had offers from multiple airlines. But I chose something different. I chose to stay in the Air Force. I chose to fly fighter jets. I chose to take everything that had happened, the flight, the lawsuit, the doubt, the vindication, and turn it into something that served a purpose larger than myself. The day I put on my pilot's wings, my mother was there. So was Mr. Patterson. So was First Officer Chen, who'd flown in specifically for the ceremony. And so, in a way, was Captain Morrison. He died 2 years after the stroke, never fully recovering, but he died knowing that he'd made something possible, that he'd changed the trajectory of a kid's life by taking a chance on him. Chen pulled me aside after the ceremony. He was older now, graying at the temples like Mr. Patterson had been. He was retired from commercial flying, consulting with airlines on safety protocols. He'd made a career out of being the person who tells the truth, no matter what. "You remember what I told you?" he asked. "That day, in the cockpit?" "Which part?" I said. "The part about you being somebody someday. Do you remember that?" "I remember you telling me I was keeping everyone alive." "Yeah," Chen said, "because that's what you do. That's what you've always done. You keep people alive. You make the hard choices. You stay steady when everything is falling apart. I'm not surprised you ended up in a fighter jet. I'm just glad you did, because the world needs more people like you in the sky." He hugged me. I felt small in his arms, the way I'd felt small in that cockpit. But I also felt capable. I also felt like I belonged there. The news covered my graduation. "Child prodigy saves flight, now a military pilot," was the headline. It wasn't entirely accurate. I wasn't a prodigy, and I hadn't saved the flight alone. But it was close enough, and I'd learned not to fight the narrative. I'd learned to let people tell their stories, and to focus on being the person my actions claimed I was. My first deployment was to the Middle East. I flew combat missions. I worked with a team. I discovered that flying a fighter jet was nothing like flying a commercial airliner, and everything like it. The same focus, the same calm, the same absolute necessity of being exactly where you needed to be, when you needed to be there. 6 months into the deployment, I got a letter. It was from a woman named Jennifer. She'd been a passenger on Flight 447. She was writing to tell me that she'd named her daughter after me. Not Marcus, the child was a girl, but she'd taken the first letter and the spirit of what I'd done, and she'd named her daughter Marcella. She was enclosing a photo. The photo showed a little girl, maybe 4 years old, with dark skin and bright eyes, and a smile that could light up a room. She was holding a toy airplane. On the back, Jennifer had written, "She's going to fly, just like you." I looked at that photo in my barracks in a desert country, flying combat missions in a jet that cost more than 100 houses, and I cried. Not because I was sad, but because I understood, finally and completely, what that day in the sky had meant. It hadn't been about me. It had never been about me. It had been about a little girl I would never meet, who would grow up knowing that a 14-year-old black kid had done something impossible, and that therefore, the impossible was possible. I kept that photo. I kept it through the rest of the deployment. I kept it through flight school specialization. I kept it through my first command. And every time I doubted myself, every time someone questioned whether I belonged in the seat I was sitting in, I looked at that photo, and I remembered. A kid from Southside Chicago had saved an airplane, and everything that came after was just him learning to live with that knowledge. Years later, I was back in Chicago. I'd made captain by then. I was teaching at the Air Force Academy, the way Mr. Patterson had taught me. A student came to my office hours, a young man, maybe 17, from the South Side. He was smart and hungry and had everything to prove. He reminded me of myself. "I want to fly," he said, "but everyone tells me I'm not smart enough, that people like me don't end up as pilots." I thought about what to say. I thought about the easiest answer, which was to tell him he was wrong and that he could do anything he wanted. I thought about the hardest answer, which was to tell him the truth about how hard it would be, how much resistance he would face, how much of his life would be spent proving that he belonged in a seat that the world didn't want him to sit in. I looked at that kid, and I saw myself, and I told him the truth. "It's going to be the hardest thing you ever do," I said. "Not the flying. That part's easy once you understand the physics. The hard part is believing when everyone around you is telling you that you shouldn't, that you have the right to be there. But here's what I know. Here's what I learned. At 35,000 feet, when I was 14 years old and terrified. The sky doesn't care about your skin color. The sky doesn't care about where you came from. The sky only cares about whether you can fly. And if you can fly, if you can focus and stay calm and understand the physics of lift, then you can do this. You can absolutely do this. He left my office with something different in his eyes. Something like hope. I never knew what happened to him, but I hoped. I hoped that he went to that summer camp. I hoped that he got his wings. I hoped that somewhere, years from now, he would be sitting in a cockpit, and he would remember that a black man in a uniform told him he could do it, and that would be enough. Because that's what Mr. Patterson had done for me. That's what Chen had done for me. And that's what I was doing for the next generation. Proving that the impossible is just the thing nobody's tried yet. The old Formica table where my mother had cried is still in her apartment. She's retired now, doesn't have to work 3 jobs anymore. The money from the airline settlement, which came years later after the lawsuit was dropped and the FAA finished its investigation, helped with that. But she kept the table. She said it was a reminder of where we came from and why it mattered that I'd flown. Sometimes I sit at that table and I think about that morning. I think about Captain Morrison collapsing. I think about Chen's voice telling me to keep the horizon level. I think about the moment the wheels touched down, and I understood that I'd done something that couldn't be undone. Something that would echo for the rest of my life. And I think about Marcella, the little girl named after me. She's in high school now. Her mother sent me a letter last year telling me that Marcella had joined the Civil Air Patrol, that she was taking flying lessons, that she wanted to be a fighter pilot, just like the boy she was named after. I wrote back. I told her that I couldn't wait to see her in the sky. I told her that the future belonged to people who were brave enough to take the controls and steady enough not to let go. I told her that I'd flown for a lot of reasons, for my grandfather's memory, for my mother's dreams, for my own survival. But now I flew for her, for the girl named after me, for all the kids from all the South Sides who were going to see what I did and understand that they could do it too. The sky is vast, it's infinite, it's terrifying and beautiful and completely indifferent to who you are. But once you understand it, once you learn to speak its language, it becomes something else. It becomes freedom. It becomes purpose. It becomes the place where a 14-year-old kid from Chicago can save an airplane and prove, forever, that impossible is just another word for something nobody's dared to try yet. I fly every day. Sometimes in a fighter jet, high and fast and alone. Sometimes in a simulator, teaching young pilots who don't yet believe in themselves. And every time I take control, every time I feel that moment when the plane responds to my will, when the sky and I understand each other perfectly, I remember. I remember a man named Chen who believed in me when I was terrified. I remember a teacher named Patterson who opened a door. I remember my mother crying at a Formica table, knowing that her son was about to touch something sacred. And I remember the moment when everything changed, when I understood that I didn't have to ask for permission to be in the sky. I just had to be steady enough to hold it.